Hello and welcome to our podcast on international trade and policy. I'm Choksun Thamo and I'll be your host for today's discussion. I'm joined by our three brilliant minds. Tawazam, a trade policy analyst, Nurbul Hamo, a global business strategist, and Diki Chodin, an expert in sustainable trade. Welcome everyone. To start us off, let's put global trade landscapes into perspective. International trade, the exchanges of goods and services across borders, have shaped the world economy for centuries. Let's dive into some of the most significant trends this year. Tawa, let's start with you. The US has increased tariffs on key imports. What's the reason behind it?
The US has raised tariff on their key imports, mainly aiming to protect their domestic industries, and this leads to triggering in retaliatory measures from their partners like Canada, Mexico, and Brazil, affecting their product from steel to agriculture.
Interesting, Dawa. Turning into Europe, the European Union's environmental regulation is making headline. Can you explain what's going on there?
The European Union has introduced strict new rules such as deforestation-free supply chain regulation, and under this regulation, exporters must now prove their products are sustainably sourced, particularly in sectors like soybean and beef.
Thanks for that. Despite these pressures, the World Trade Organization is still projecting trade growth this year. How is this possible given the current climate?
Despite these challenges, the World Trade Organization expects trade to grow by 3% in 2025, helped by low inflation and interest rate. However, the risks remain same due to geopolitical tension and regional conflicts.
Now, let's talk about how this policy affects business operations. Nurbu, how do trade policies like tariffs and quotas influence pricing, competition, and market access?
Trade policies such as tariffs, quotas, and subsidies directly affect market access, pricing, and competition. For example, higher tariffs can make imported goods more expensive, benefiting the local producers, but raising costs for the consumers.
Great insights, Nurbu. What about enforcement?
Trade agreements, such as those under World Trade Organization, aim to reduce these barriers and create fair, predictable rules for everyone. But when disputes arise, mechanisms like World Trade Organization's dispute resolution system helps maintain order and resolve conflicts.
Let's look at the real-world examples. What is the long-term impact of the US-China trade war?
Tariffs imposed by both the countries disrupted global supply chains, raised prices, and forced the companies to rethink sourcing strategies.
And what about Brexit? How has Brexit altered the trade dynamics between the UK and the European Union?
The UK's departure from EU created new custom checks and regulatory hurdles, impacting everything from car manufacturing to food exports.
And what about China's export control on critical minerals?
In response to US and EU tech restrictions, China imposed export controls on key metals like gallium and germanium, which is vital for semiconductors and defense. This has disrupted global supply chains and forced tech companies to seek alternative sources in Africa, Australia, and South America.
Now, let's shift gear to emerging issues shaping trade in 2025. Diki Chodin, digital trade is booming. What's being done to regulate digital goods and data flows?
As more commercial activities are done through online, countries are developing new rules for the digital goods and data flows.
Very timely, Diki. How are businesses responding to the growing demand for sustainable practices?
To talk about sustainability, there is growing emphasis on environmental and social standards with policy targeting carbon emissions and labor rights.
And Diki, are we seeing more regional trade cooperation?
Yes, some countries are forming regional trade blocs to reduce dependency on global chains and to strengthen the local economies.
Let's now shift our focus to the human side of trade. It's not just about goods and services. Trade has a direct and growing impact on jobs and workers across the globe. Tawa, what trends are we seeing in 2025 when it comes to labor and trade?
Trade doesn't just move goods, it moves people and shape jobs. In 2025, shifting our trading policy has a direct impact on labor market worldwide, and sectors like manufacturing, logistics and agriculture are being restructured by automation, a trade barrier and sustainability requirement. Skilled workers are in high demand in green industries, digital trade and compliant roles. At the same time, workers in traditional sector may face displacement without proper retaining programs, and government are under pressure to support upskillings while business are rethinking where and how they hire. And I think the future of trade is closely tied to the workforce, and ensuring equitable access to opportunities will be a key part of sustainable, inclusive economic growth.
So the future of trade really hinges on how we support people, not just policies. Great insights. Let's wrap things up by looking at how trade policy affects the people at the end of the chain, consumers. In 2025, trade is having a more visible impact on everyday shopping habits and expectations. Tiki, what changes are consumers feeling most directly?
Trade policy isn't just about governments and corporations. It affects everyday consumers in real ways. In 2025, rising tariffs and strict import standards are influencing what we buy, how much we pay, and where our product comes from. At the same time, consumer awareness is reshaping trade, where shoppers are demanding ethically produced goods, products that meet environmental, labor, and human rights standards. This is pressuring companies to ensure transparency across supply chains and invest in responsible sourcing.
That brings us to an end of today's episode of International Trade and Policy in 2025. And a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their thoughtful contributions, and to our listeners for joining us. Global trade is changing fast, but with the right insight and strategies, businesses and governments can navigate this shifting landscape. Stay informed, and we will see you next time on our next episode of Home Based Podcast. Thank you.